Will democracy survive in the next couple of years?
And essentially, we are the same.
And there are so many needs that Minnesota has.
What people are saying they need right now.
Access to democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center in Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Firefly Credit Union, with locations throughout the Twin Cities, has proudly served Minnesotans since 1925. Firefly guides its members forward by delivering customized financial solutions to improve their lives in all aspects of banking. Firefly Credit Union, they light the way with life illuminated. EDINA Eye, Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years. Now in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, EDINA Eye offers comprehensive services for dedicated specialists committed to excellence with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
Welcome. Another Zoom session of Access to Democracy. Alan Miller here. We have a first-time guest, a gentleman who I've known for well over 20 years, and he actually wanted to come on the show probably a dozen years ago or so. And I said, go out and write a book, and then we'll have you on the show. So he went out and wrote a book. And now we can welcome Dr. Rob Shumer, PhD, with all sorts of educational credits. So why don't you give us a little background, Rob, on yourself?
Thanks, Alan. I've been in education for about 50 years. Started as a junior high and high school teacher, ran some programs in the 1970s, which kind of gave me a basis for what I'm going to talk about, and that is experiential and community-based learning. Then I went on to develop a high school for health sciences as my dissertation in Los Angeles, and worked at UCLA as the director of field studies, working with faculty and community. And came to Minnesota in the early 90s and started the National Service Learning Clearinghouse and have been doing research and areas related to career and technical education, service learning, civic education. But the grounding is really in what I would call experiential learning.
So why don't we talk about service learning, and then we can talk about your book. But what is service learning?
Well, there are about 160 definitions. It's a good question. It has something to do with service, doing community service, and learning academic subjects. And to give you some of the background, I just wanted to cite a couple of things from my own history. In the 70s, I was very fortunate to be involved in a national program called experience-based career education. And the whole idea was to focus on careers, but to have active connection with community to learn academic subjects. And the best way to describe it would be to talk about a student who wanted to be a veterinarian. So here's an 11th grade student. She spent 3 full days a week at an animal shelter. She worked with a veterinarian, with animal technicians. She did operations. She studied the anatomy of animals, dogs, cats. She studied the history of the United States around issues of animals. And she spent time going to elementary schools to teach kids how to take care of cats and dogs. What happened as a result of her work was that the kids went home and told their parents that there were these dogs and cats at the animal shelter. The adoption rate went up 20%. So her service in sharing her information actually saved the lives of dogs and cats. And so the whole notion of service learning is that you provide a service to the community, but you do it in the context of learning your academic subjects. As another example, I had a student who was interested in golf. Now, you don't think of golf as an academic subject, but he spent 2 days a week at a golf course, worked with a golf professional, but he also had to study a book on the physics of golf. He studied the history of golf and discovered that there are all kinds of social inequities in golf courses, that there were a lot of discrimination against blacks, against Jews in terms of joining golf clubs. And so the whole notion of service learning is you do community service and you do it in the context of learning academic subjects.
Well, in doing some research on the subject, knowing that you were coming on today, I am led to believe that there are three concepts to service learning. One is the common good. Two is how it affects a civil society. And three is learning by doing. Is that a fair statement?
Since that's the first chapter in my book, yes.
Okay, and that's the chapter that you wrote, right? Where's the wisdom in service learning? Why don't you hold up the book? And there it is. It's got chapters by yourself and many other recognized really peers of yours and experts in the field. And interesting to me is that none of these authors, according to what I've read, have faculty positions or are full-time teachers at the time that this was written.
Right.
Why would that be?
Well, it relates to the whole notion of experiential learning. I've written a lot of papers and did a study of academic learning and academics. And one of the interesting things was, one of the definitions of academic was of theoretical, not practical value. And so in higher education and in a lot of the academic disciplines, the belief is that the real learning is about theory. Learning how to do something is a secondary importance. There used to be an old saying that smart people use their minds and dumb people use their hands. And that's been part of the tradition of vocational education around the world. And so one of the reasons that these faculty, and myself included, I've been a faculty member at the University of Minnesota, at UCLA, but always on a marginal basis. Because what I always wanted to do was to say I would teach my courses, but they had to be done in the context of a community connection. One of the reasons for the title of the book, Where's the Wisdom in Service Learning, is the belief that we should be teaching for wisdom, not knowledge. And one of the
Which
things
belies the statement that you made, is that smart people use their brains and those not smart use their hands. I have a lot of trouble with that, because there are a lot of people who use their hands who really are the people who make this society go and function, whether it's picking in the fields or just what it is. But I'm troubled by that statement.
Well, but let me add to it by saying one of the definitions of wisdom that I use in the book is that wisdom is comprised of three elements: theoretical knowledge, creative knowledge, and practical knowledge. And so the notion of being wise is based upon the fact that you not only know the theory, but you know how things are applied, and you can apply them in new contexts. And so that's why I actually have a quote. I've done a lot of work in Asia. I've taught in Beijing and Singapore and Hong Kong. And Confucius had 5 principles of ethical behavior. And the fifth one talks about the fact that the purpose of education is to prepare people to be responsible members of society. And being a responsible member means that you require wisdom in order to participate. And so the notion of wisdom is, I think, addressing the concern that you have you can't be wise unless you have both, that you have theoretical knowledge, that you have practical knowledge, and you also have kind of a creative element. How can these things be put together in a different way? And so that's what's evident in the stories of these 10 people in the book, is that they all came from different perspectives. Some of them are from the K-12 world. I'm one of the few people in the field who has a background in K-12 work, who's worked in higher education, and also I was on the board of directors for the Red Cross and worked in a program in Los Angeles where we started the first youth disaster action team for the Red Cross.
Over your resume, it looked like you had a background in just about every field of education, from kindergarten right up to institution building, which goes beyond higher education. So I guess in 50 years, you've done it all.
Well, in some respects, and I've been very blessed to be in situations that have allowed me to do the connecting. When I did my dissertation, I was at UCLA, and a doctor from the Drew Medical School approached UCLA and said, "Can you help us develop this high school for health sciences?" And so my chair referred me to them. And their notion was that they were going to have doctors and nurses come to the Magnet High School, which was right across the street from the King Drew Medical Center, and talk about all of these medical things. And I said, well, why can't the kids go across the street to the medical center? And that would be their schooling. And so when we started talking about what people did in the medical center, I actually developed curriculum for 120 different sites. So you went to pulmonary functions, your service was helping to transport patients and talk to patients. But you also learned about pulmonary functions. You learned about how the lungs worked. You learned about smoking, and you learned about how to present programs to young people to help them make sure that their lungs were clean. This was in Los Angeles when we had all kinds of problems with smog.
In Los Angeles, lungs are not free whether they smoke or not.
Right. But the interesting thing with this high school is the kids who were studying cardiology with the heart doctors started a proposal to LA Unified, and they said, "You're feeding us food at our high school," because the food was brought into the school because we were off campus or off a traditional high school campus. And they said it's high fat, high salt content, which is leading to health problems. And so they actually developed a proposal and got LA Unified to change the diet, change the food that they brought to the high school. And so this was a way to begin to develop, related to your program, Access to Democracy, how to become a member, an active member in a democracy, to use knowledge and to take social action. And so that's always been part of this background. And getting back to one of the definitions of service learning is there's a belief that the reason that you do the service is for issues of social justice.
Well, there's, I guess, a Professor Theobald, and he said something about your book, which I thought was prescient, which is healthy people are giving and helping other healthy people to grow. That's, I think, a fair statement of just what you have said and what you are endeavoring to do.
Well, and I think I've devoted much of my life to working with young people. Being 73, I guess anybody under 65 is young, but seriously,
I think anybody under 75 is young.
Oh, okay, okay. But what we know about democracy, and doing a lot of work with voter registration, we have a youth fellows program at the League of Women Voters, we're working with the Youth in Government program and the YMCA, is that voting patterns are habits. That if people start to vote when they're very young, when they're 18 and 19, it becomes a lifelong habit. For kids who don't participate, it becomes problematic. In fact, the kids who are least involved in democracy and in voting and community life are high school dropouts. So I've done a lot of work with the Dropout Prevention Network, which was at Clemson University, and the Dropout Prevention Center, so that we can develop these programs that are engaging young people in real challenges. Let me go back to my first year of teaching. I was a reading teacher. I took my high school kids who hated school, were poor readers, to a first grade class around the corner where I had a friend, and so my kids helped tutor the first graders. It was easier reading for my kids because they could certainly read above first grade, but many of them were not that much better. They developed relationships with one another. The high school kids would hear stories from the elementary kids. That became part of their spelling lessons because they couldn't spell some of the words because they had to produce something that the kids could read and make sure that the spelling was correct. The elementary kids drew pictures and they created books based on the writing to present to their parents. But when we evaluated the program, and I asked my students, I said, how come you keep showing up on Wednesday when we go down to the elementary school or the kids come up, when you usually don't attend school very well? They said, you know, we don't want those kids to grow up to be like us. Here were kids who knew what it was like to go through school and be a poor reader and being told that you're stupid. And they had that experience to be able to take it back and say, we don't want those first graders to have to live lives that we've lived. And what it taught me was that people who are often considered to be the failures in society have lived experiences that have the wisdom and the knowledge that can be shared.
Which goes to prove the concept that if given a chance, just about anybody, obviously there are some few exceptions, but just about anybody can rise above the situation that they're in if they get the proper background, if they get the proper education, and in many cases, if they get the proper diet, which is a big problem in our students today.
Well, and the notion is that the community is very rich and has a lot to contribute. When we were developing this high school in the 1980s, the kids would go to the medical center. The medical center had centrifuges that were very modern and up to date. The centrifuges in the science program from LA Unified were outdated. They looked like washing machines from the 1940s. We were the only high school in the United States that had $1 million electron microscope in our science program. We had a $500,000 IBM mainframe at the medical school, so kids were learning COBOL in the 1980s, long before anybody else was really getting a chance to do that. So what it also taught me was that the community has resources that are rich, not only in terms of materials, but in terms of people.
Well, let's move to, I wanted to ask you one thing before we moved on. The National Society for Experiential Education, what is that? Are you one of the founders of it?
Well, I'm not a founder. It started in, I believe, 71. It's going to have its 50th anniversary next year. But it was one of the early organizations, primarily in higher education, that was pushing for more experiential kinds of programs. They dealt with a lot of internships. So it was NSIEE, National Society for Internships and Experiential Education. They later dropped the I, but the focus was on developing experiential programs in higher education. I was involved, I was on their board in the 1980s. I've been involved in some other organizations doing research. So a lot of the movement, Campus Compact, I helped start Campus Compact in California in the late 1980s. Campus Compact is a group of about 1,200 colleges and universities around the United States that have a mission of civic involvement. And I do a lot of work. I teach a class in principles of civic education at Metro State. And Metro State, in their mission statement, their last line is an unwavering commitment to civic engagement. So lots of universities say that what they're trying to produce are students that not only know things in academic areas, but who can be active citizens and contribute to society.
Now, moving forward to today, we certainly have problems in education, and plus that we have the pandemic. So what do you see as the biggest threat to education today, in a general sense, before we talk about the pandemic?
Well, I think that the reliance on online learning as the primary delivery of education has problems. I did a 5-year study in New Jersey of their teacher education program in career and tech ed, which was online. They met one Saturday a month in class, and then the rest of it was done online through groups and things of that nature. When we evaluated that program and we said, what was the most impactful part of the program? They said it was the lunch during the Saturday that they met, because they had a chance to talk to one another and to ask each other questions that were important to them. And so it's kind of colored my notion of education, that in going back to some of my preparation, John Dewey wrote a book called Experience in Education in the 1930s, and he starts it out by saying it's not an either-or situation. It's not just classroom learning, it's not just experiential learning, but you need both. And so I think the challenge with the pandemic is that a lot of kids that I work with who are in the dropout category, potential dropout, are not particularly engaged. And teachers are reporting that these kids just don't show up online, partly because some of them are from poorer communities and they don't have internet access. But the whole function, and I've written a lot of stuff about engagement in learning, and that seems to be the key. If you have an interest in something, then you're interested in learning. We're trying to create lifelong learners, not just somebody who can sit in a class for 15 weeks and digest information and take a test.
Okay. I have a thought in my mind that's been troubling me for some time about education right now, is that we have certainly a federal program which seems to be focusing on charter schools and Betsy DeVos, and putting that ahead of public education. And that to me is very troublesome. What do you think about that?
Well, without being too political, I think part of the challenge, again, if you believe in experiential learning, the fact that Betsy DeVos has never been in a public school is a challenge, because her whole orientation is toward private schools and toward expanding private education. For those of us who are committed to democracy and civic education, there's a strong belief that public education is a necessary component. In fact, we argue that it's nothing to just be able to vote. We want to have educated voters. We want to have people who can make decisions, and those decisions have to be based on learning. In fact, in one paper that I wrote many years ago, I concluded by saying service without a learning dimension was disservice. Just because somebody had a grandparent doesn't mean that they knew how to get along with senior citizens. Just because somebody knew how to read didn't mean that they knew how to teach other people how to read. And so I think in her case, there is an overemphasis on some of the charter schools. And I think that having studied some of the charter schools, there's some very bizarre schools around the country that have profit motives, that have motives that seem to be other than the public good. And so I don't have a problem with charter schools if, in fact, the charter schools are run by public programs. Charter schools were actually endorsed by Al Shanker and the Teachers Union in the 1980s because they wanted to do some innovative kinds of programs, the programs that ran in the 70s.
The concept of charter schools is just that they want to do innovative things and they want to come out statistically ahead. But where we have gone, from what I read throughout the country, is these for-profit schools have sort of shunted that aside, and we seem to be no better statistically with the charter schools than we are with the public schools. And the question in my mind is, then why do we have charter schools if they've really gotten so far away from the concept?
Well, as part of the political thing, I remember in talking with Avi before, dealing with the politics of education, one of the reasons that service learning and experiential education has had a challenge is, number one, it's complicated. It takes coordination with community and schools. But the other thing is risk management, that kids have to drive in cars or walk and go off campus. But the third one, and the hard one, is it allows for individualized instruction. And there are a lot of businesses that make their money developing standardized tests. There are a lot of businesses that sell books and want you to use their curriculum. So going back to the student that I talked about who was the veterinarian, there was no curriculum for that particular program. There were books on animal sciences, which she did use, but there were no books on how to create the opportunities for her to do the work that she did in the community. Now, her benefit was that she got a letter of recommendation from the head of the Veterinarian Society in Los Angeles when she was going to college, so that was another benefit. The other piece was that she was there 3 days a week, and her math teacher, she was taking a pre-calculus class on the high school campus, but could only go 2 days a week, and her math teacher said she could never pass if she only showed up 2 days a week. Well, she got a B+ in the class. But what we found was that 3 of her friends got A's. Why? Because they had to teach her what she missed the 3 days that she wasn't in class. So one of the best ways to learn something is to have to teach it to somebody else. So there's this kind of mutual benefit of doing community work. And that's part of the challenge. In the COVID issue, what I've written some pieces about how universities need to work with K-12 schools, so that college students, as part of a sociology class, can be working with an elementary school and studying the social issues that the kids are facing, and studying low-income communities. So they could study the academic part of sociology, but they are there to help the elementary school children. When we did that at UCLA, as an example, we had a sociology class. We had 75 college students who were working with 3 elementary schools in the Los Angeles area. So that would be, we would add 30 students to an elementary school who could work with some teachers. So we had small group discussions that were led by the college students. So a teacher could have a class of 25 kids, and there would be 5 college students with 5 kids in the elementary school. So there are ways that we can connect them, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges for the COVID response, is to get colleges to work with schools, but also to get the kids to work in their communities. We had programs where kids organized with college student support child care centers. So they were learning about child development by having hands-on experience with children, getting support from college students who supposedly knew more about the theories of child development.
In the couple of minutes we have left,
Okay.
what do you think of the situation where we have history being rewritten? There are schools in Texas that use Texas published books that are completely different and divergent from some of the more important events in our historical background. How does that fit into into all this? Excuse me.
Well, it's the challenge of some of the philosophies of what we would teach in history. Some people think in the standards movement that you needed to know what the Constitution was and you need to know about the Bill of Rights, but they didn't teach anything about Jim Crow and social injustice and all kinds of repressive things that happened not only in the South,
And are still happening, I might
and are
add.
still happening. And so that's part of the challenge, especially when you allow kids to go out and to start to develop curriculum and start to do evaluation. In all of these years, I think one of the important elements of being a citizen is to learn how to be an evaluator, to evaluate progress in your own community, to evaluate your own growth and development. And so I think that part of the politics is who makes the schools, who sells books to the schools, who does the tests. And the other piece is, what is civic education? What should people know in order to make change?
Well, that indicates that there's a real importance in the composition of boards of education, because those are the people that make the decision with the professionals in terms of what is taught, what books are used, and how many, etc. So I think that's something that has to be considered.
Well, and as an advocate for young people, there are a lot of boards that do allow for a young person to be a board member. In fact, Michael Moore, who's quite famous or infamous, actually ran for his school board when he was 18 and was elected. And so there's a need for youth voice on boards to have the youth perspective and talk about what's working in schools, what's not working. And so if there's a general pattern, Alan, I would say it's about building community so that everybody works together. We learn from one another. And maybe the last thing I could say in relationship to all of these things is that when I was thinking about this interview and your program, one of the things that you might do to help us expand civic education would be to have access to democracy as a regular program in high schools, where high school kids would be doing what you're doing the interviews, trying to find out who are the business people and who are the leaders in their community that they can interview and raise issues.
Well, certainly something that we would follow up and be interested in if it comes to pass. We've been talking with Dr. Rob Shumer, PhD, involved in education for over 50 years, author of the book, one chapter of the book, Where's the Wisdom in Service Learning? We've been talking about service learning and how it carries itself out and down into the community and the values of the education of students. Rob, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, I appreciate it, and I want to thank you for having your program. Access to Democracy is a model of what good democratic processes are all about.
Thanks again.
Thank you.